and then you uploaded it to our drive after.
Yep.
Because remember, like when you log off, I think it like has to go to your desktop or something.
That's right. It took like 4 hours to upload. Sweet. Okay. Well, we got a freaking party, so we can start. This is great. Quinn, do you want to do a little intro on yourself, or do you want me to give you a little intro?
Oh, I'll say a little something about myself. I'm a physical therapist in Orange County, California, and I have a little practice inside of a gym, which is cool. And that's kind of the scenario. That's kind of the environment that I've been in since I've started. I'm graduated in 2013, so I'll be going on my 7th year out. So I'm not, still very, very young in this game, and but with enough years under my belt to have some semblance of what the heck's going on in this field, I think, or at least have a better understanding of where my shortcomings are and what I don't know. So it's good. I enjoy, have as much passion for the field as ever, and I love what we're going to talk about today, is because I think it really provides a foundation for everything that we do, no matter what setting you're in, no matter what prior beliefs you're coming in here with, or what biases, nuanced stuff that doesn't matter until we kind of create a common ground on some big concepts and topics. And I think just the concept of evidence-based practice is one of those. So I'm excited to dig in here.
Sweet. Okay, so yeah, Quinn posted 2 articles that I sent y'all earlier this week. We have the evidence-based medicine has been hijacked by Ioannidis, and then the progress in evidence-based medicine a quarter century on.
So the Ioannidis article is an interesting one. That's actually a letter. So David Sackett is deceased, and Ioannidis is writing this letter to him, but it's kind of a call to action to everybody, obviously, but it's just kind of in this narrative form to Sackett, which I think is pretty cool. It keeps it interesting. But David Sackett is the guy who wrote an editorial in 92, I think it was, where we have these 3 pillars of evidence-based medicine. And it's evidence and expertise and patient preference. And that's kind of where this whole thing blows up into these 3. You'll see them all over the place, different models. It's a stool, it's a funnel, it's a Venn diagram. You've got these 3 components. Well, it's from David Sackett's paper way back when. And what's interesting is it's a very short editorial. It's less than 2 pages long, but yet it holds this weight in this legacy and beyond. And I think these 2 papers really do a good job of saying, okay, what do these things actually mean, and where are we with this concept of evidence-based medicine? And then Gordon Guyatt, the second author on the progress in evidence-based medicine a quarter century on, Gordon Guyatt is actually the one who coined the phrase evidence-based model. But Gordon Guyat's the guy that coined the phrase, but that whole crew, in the early 90s, into the 80s, early 90s, is there who really were pushing the needle on this practice. And so we owe a lot to this group. But if you read these 2 papers, I like to get a feel for the room in regards to what you guys, after you read these papers, what do you feel? Because there can be a bit of a doomsday feeling, or kind of like a nihilistic, wow, just none of this matters because it's, 85% of published research is either biased or a waste. 50% of publications don't get published. And so you have this drawer effect, thousands and thousands of articles coming out every year. You can't possibly keep up all of these things that may seemingly be a negative. But I'm just curious if anybody wants to speak up on their initial feelings after reading these.
Yeah, I'll go first. Especially the Ioannidis one. It's just so, in my opinion, I don't know, just overly cynical in a way, and very pessimistic. And I guess both of them had that tone, but I mean, they're both highly respected individuals, so they kind of have the right to be overly pessimistic and kind of talk like really openly about how they feel about this. But yeah, it is kind of where do you go from here with just like everyone says evidence-based practice or evidence-based medicine, and then you have these two like highly regarded individuals saying that like hasn't made much progress. What even is it? Like how can we even trust some of this research coming out because of all these kind of conflicts of interest? So that's my initial kind of thought into it.
Yeah, I'm kind of the same way. This from day one of like PT school, but then I feel like that's what we're told. And then you read something like this, and you mentioned a minute ago, like the 50% of papers don't get published. It's like, so what is not getting published? Is there really important things that we should have read that people are protecting for maybe their own ego that was mentioned in the letter? And so like, I don't know. It's kind of like what do you do from here with that is kind of where I was thinking.
Anybody
Yeah,
else? Yeah.
I thought it was pretty interesting because it definitely can give like a almost like doomsday, kind of like we're doomed. There's not really like a whole lot to do, but at the same time, I think you kind of have to balance it with, and I think I may have actually heard you say it before, Quinn, on like one of your podcasts or something, but you have to at some point take what we're given and do something and make like a clinical decision with that, with the patient that's sitting in front of you. And so I think you do definitely have to kind of like balance it there. Yeah, that's just kind of my input. Sorry.
Well, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Alec, but I don't know, when I like read these papers and I think about it, I'm like, well, what is evidence, and then what does it mean to be evidence-based? And you know, you can technically have anecdotal evidence, and that's evidence, and you can be evidence-based, and you can kind of practice based off of what you've done, what you've seen yourself, maybe what you've seen in the clinical experience and stuff like that. So I think like what Gordon Guy, especially in his paper, what he's trying to do is trying to kind of like create some clarifications, like, hey, this is what it actually means to practice evidence-based medicine. So yeah, I mean, and it's also true too, like you can, I mean, even if you're not just going off anecdotal evidence, you can just go off of, you know, 5 studies, and you just find 5 studies to support anything, you know? And so I think that's kind of what they're trying to do, is like delineate, like, this is having evidence, and then this is evidence-based medicine. That's kind of what I got out of it.
Yeah, well, at first I read like the first page of the paper. I'm like, is this the right paper for a research? No, but I felt like I got like I've felt a lot of the same feelings that that guy felt when he was talking to some of the older physicians about like trying to change their perspective and like show different ideas, and then it's like they just come back with like, well, you're just this guy, and you know, we do it this way and we're going to keep doing it this way. And then also like I thought it was interesting when he started talking about like the money aspect of it, and also bringing in the same thing happens in like the health and fitness industry and stuff like that. So yeah, I agree.
Anybody else? I think we can all. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to jump in here. I kind of liked the progressing EBM just because I thought it did a pretty good job and like a thorough job of like sort of breaking down the challenges and struggles that like evidence-based practice and medicine have. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And then sort of just that like Dear Diary, everything's on fire in that other editorial. I think it's an editorial. Anyway, but I thought that was, yes, it's very cynical, but at the same time, I kind of think of it as more of like a challenge that we need to keep addressing. And so then like pairing those two together, okay, we've got progressing EBM, here's all the challenges with it. And then sort of coming in from the other other side, like an individual perspective of it. I thought it was a good pairing.
Yeah, for me personally, I think it's easy to, especially read the Ioannidis paper and either then like almost create a wall against him because, oh wait, I come in with this passion of wanting to be an evidence-based medicine practitioner, and here he is talking about the things that he's talking about. But it's like we said, it's important to understand that Ioannidis and the other two authors, along with the many that they cite in their papers, I mean, these guys are the founding fathers of what we're even talking about today. We're not having this discussion without these specific authors paving the way. And I think what it shows is that, wow, 3 decades, and here we are of the crew that really pushed this movement forward. Still, we're still dealing with these issues, and I think it just brings it back to reality. Because what is science anyway? Science is the process of managing uncertainty and kind of whittling down closer to this thing we call truth that's never actually attainable, but we can get closer and closer to it. And I see what we're doing now is just still trying to refine and iterate the process of that. And that's what I take from these papers. It's just it's real, it's reality of what we're dealing with here. But they always, in both papers, they sandwich with, we're passionate about this movement and we're negative. Here's all the shit that we're dealing with. And then we're still passionate about this movement. Like, let's keep going. So, nobody's given up on this process. I think it just at least anchors us to what we still have to work on. Well, that's just me. As we pivot, what do you guys find in your current situation, either as a student or a clinician, the difficulties, the barriers that you have either implementing what you consider evidence-based practice into your practice with your interactions with your patients and or your interactions with your colleagues or professors? I know that's a big question, but just think about it for you. It could even be that happened recently. Conversations with colleagues, interactions with patients.
I think
Go ahead.
Oh, no, you can go ahead, Shelby. You're good.
Do it. You got it, man.
Okay. So I think for I'm a second year PT student. And so I think for us right now, everyone's trying to figure out where we obviously we haven't gone on any rotations or anything like that. So we have not been in a clinic yet to make these decisions with patients. But we talk about we receive very legalistic type thinking, I think, a lot of times within school. But then it gets thrown into this idea of I think a lot of times people are well, patient preference should be the utmost most important thing. And it's yeah, sometimes I feel sometimes, but if my current thinking is we want to promote the most autonomous patient we can. And if I think a lot of times, how do we implement these modalities, or are we supposed to implement these modalities? And people are well, if the patient really wants it, let's just give it to them. And it's yeah, but what's our end goal? And so if evidence is showing that we shouldn't really be focusing on these things where people can become really dependent, then I don't know, it's a weird dynamic to walk with, because obviously if they're feeling better or we get them to a goal in some way, then in some ways, yes, that's a win. But also, what did we have to do to get to that? So we're getting them where they think they had to receive this certain modality to get there. And that's kind of where I think I kind of deal with, I guess, talking to classmates or anything like that. It's because they're thinking, well, let's get it, at least if we just want to get them better, whatever route that means, let's get them there. But it's what about the repercussions down the road? Are we hurting the time frame?
Yeah, and I think the biggest challenge with, at least when I talk with people, mainly students and other professors and other clinicians, is I think there's a big misconception of, like, oh, we got to have evidence to support what we do, but evidence-based practice is a three-pronged stool or whatever, and it's just they're not equal legs. It's more of like a funnel, as Eric Meyer put it. It's more of a funnel, and if a patient really really wants to do like leech therapy or cranial sacral therapy or whatever, like, are you just gonna do it? Like, that's like that. So that's when people say that's like, oh, a patient wants it. It's like, well, let's just say, what if the patient asks for whatever? Like, are you gonna do that for real? Like at a certain point, you would talk to them and say, hey, honestly, we're not doing much here. Let's not. I don't know. I think there's a big misconception of what exactly is evidence-based medicine, and just kind of how to apply it. Like, you can't just take a paper or two and be evidence-based. You have to consider the totality of evidence before you kind of move forward on things, Yeah, sorry, I kind of got ranty there.
So angry, Nate.
I think
Yeah,
Mine is very similar to Nick, actually. And kind of going back to your first question, Quinn, the thing that like stuck out to me, I think I just like left the paper feeling like really conflicted, was the sentence that says, in the context, or not in the context, back up. Evidence never determines decisions. It is always evidence in the context of values and preferences. And so tying that into, Nick, to your point with how relevant is patient preference in regards to, or in relation to evidence, that's like such a hard tension. Like personally, like I had just a patient like this week who I hadn't seen her for probably 2 months because of COVID. She was seeing us for frozen shoulder. In the meantime, was going to Cairo. And this isn't a jab at Cairo. I actually really like working with good ones. This is more of a jab at just my own like conflict. Anyway, she got like laser done, ultrasound done. Pain was significantly better with that personally, because I was like, man, like she went somewhere else, had modalities done. She feels significantly better. And so that was just like frustrating for me, because if she came to me and asked me to do those things, I just would tell her like, no, like we're not doing that. And so anyway, it's just on like a real recent note. I think that's just like a very real conflict internally that I've had and still have.
I feel like it's hard too, like when it's like the specific modality. I always joke with Chris and Kevin all the time about like a non-zero risk, like, but there's like, if there's not that, like, I don't know, if we're not like harming these patients, like an absurd, like, I don't know, I'm just now jumbling up my own like thoughts, but like how much risk is there? And like, if this is going to get them, I don't know. Now I'm just like thinking.
I have a few thoughts that I don't want to inject my context, and that can kind of further the discussion, because this, I mean, ultimately what we're talking about right now is one of the main barriers about all of this, right? I think, Shelby, it's funny that you mentioned that quote or that particular passage in the Guide article. I have that highlighted, and I think it might be confusing for people. I think it would read better if it said, evidence never determines decisions. It is always evidence in the context of informed consent. And I think informed consent is a big piece of this, because ultimately it's the patient's decision, and this is shared decision making on our part. So there's always the choice, and I say these things explicitly. We can always do nothing, as in you can just, I don't think that your leg is going to fall off and you can just leave and not do a thing. And things, things could get better in the case of things like patellofemoral pain, and actually natural regression to the mean, they don't happen as much. And so like intervention is sometimes more necessary, but we have that conversation. So you always have the option of doing nothing. We also have the option of trying X, Y, Z. Now, if they ask, well, what about ultrasound? I had ultrasound, or I've seen it before, and maybe what we're talking about, Nick. Informed consent applies. So we have our biases, but in this case, we can just say the evidence shows that Ultrasound does heat the tissues. It does do that. So does a heat pack, and so does a warm up. Unplug the machine. The effects are the same as far as pain and function, the effects are the same. And you say these things, you're just disseminating the evidence for them. You're distilling it down. This is the key question, because it's still their decision. If the answer is yes, we're at the same crossroads, but there's some give and take. You can say, okay, we can do this. I'm not going to bill for it. And we can do it at the end of the session. Something like that. Many times what you're going to find is the patient's now educated. They just thought that it was something that was good and that did stuff. And a lot of times they will say, okay, well, no, if it's doesn't no different if the machine's plugged in, then, I don't need it, something like that. But I think it's important to anchor the conversation to informed consent. And as a healthcare professional, you can just lay out the options based on your understanding of the evidence. And that helps. That takes out some of this, like, guru-y, I have to be this crazy good educated. I'm simply the healthcare provider providing you options. It's your decision to make. I happen to not have an ultrasound machine in my clinic, so I'd be like, oh, sorry. I'll stop there with that. And does anybody have any follow-up on that piece?
Yeah, I had something real quick. So when we were talking about this, one of, even socially, not just from a therapeutic standpoint or professional standpoint, but even in just your relationships in life, a foolish choice to make is making compromise. That entails that there is like a 50% loss from each party, or that there is some degree of loss from each party coming into a mutual decision that neither one feels is completely whole into what they wanted. So when you come into, let's say, going back to the ultrasound, one side wants it, the other side doesn't want it. And by trying to find compromise where you're kind of giving in a bit and they're kind of getting what they're wanting, middle a true mutual purpose. And so I think, Quinn, what you said about helping them see the evidence and then make that decision, I think you do find mutual purpose to where you can both agree 100% in a direction, because you found something that you've educated the person, you've made the options all available, you've shown them what research evidence, even if it's just a quick conversation, is available to them. You've outlined what it is that they're trying to get to. Let's go back to the patellofemoral pain, and maybe they just have some superior quad tendon kind of pain and they want an ultrasound right there. You present that option. You can tell them, here are a number of things that have been shown to work and to work well, and this has worked in a couple of other patients I've been seeing, and this is what I would like to try. You think that ultrasound is working, here's what the evidence says. Ultimately, our goal is for you, or maybe your goal for you is to not have this pain when you do a particular activity, whatever it is that is. You can choose what that is and go down that road with them. And when they're ready to change, they can change. And that way, I don't think you have as much butting heads with the patient as much, when you found that, okay, you want to get better, and I know you want to get better. I have some things I think will work better, but you have some things that you think will work better. Here's what the evidence says. Now, when you choose, now my mutual purpose is to follow whatever it is that you've chosen to give you the best care that you think will work, and let you have the experiences going forward. And I think that is a very amenable solution to a very complex cause, because a lot of people in this evidence-based practice realm and reading these papers, situation where patients have a lot of beliefs, and they weren't born with those beliefs. Somebody told them those beliefs, whether that's cultural, society, family members. Oftentimes it's a physician that's told them that, yeah, their zygoepiphyseal joint at L4, L5 is fucked up and that's causing their pain, when we know that you can inject, saline solution or some aggravating thing in a joint, and you could have pain on the opposite side and up all over the back. And the point of where pain is, who knows, right? There's a lot of questions there, but allowing them to have an option to choose, and then finding those experiences along the way, and ultimately your goal and their goal is to improve their function or improve whatever it is that they're trying to. I think that's a better way of handling that situation, and not so much getting so ticky-tacky about, well, evidence says this, so therefore I won't do that for you. I don't know if that makes sense what I'm trying to say, because I certainly think that we should all be moving towards the slow-moving ship that is evidence-based practice. Like when you were saying that, it's a tight, slow funnel, but if not that, then what, right? We are trying to whittle down to what is truth, what is the best treatments, or what, and we don't even know what those are. But we know some things that have been proven well over time, or some things that tend to work well for most people. And, following and hopping on board that slow moving ship is better than the hearsay of some guru, right? And so finding that amenable solution that both parties feel that we're moving in the right direction, I think comes from what the patient wants, and just giving them that education up front. So thanks for saying that.
One note on something one question that Nick raised, and Q, that was awesome, man. Thank you for that. By the way, is that a nod to Never Split the Difference? The book? Don't, find a...
That and Crucial Conversations, those two books.
Fantastic. Crucial Conversations, Crucial Confrontations, Crucial Accountability. Those books are tremendous for almost like the science of communication and having a conversation and listening. But to a question that Nick posed, is it really that bad, or what's the cost? Ultrasound. I'll keep going to ultrasound. What's the harm? Placebo, whatever. If they feel better, they feel better. Well, there's always a cost. It's called opportunity cost. And even if it's as simple as time, you have a finite amount of time with this person. What are you going to fill that time with? And exercise has non-specific effects. Everything has non-specific effects or some type of placebo component. But beyond that, what does it have? Where we have something like ultrasound or various modalities, non-specific, they have effects. Beyond that, what are the effects? And then when we compare that to, if I have a finite amount of time and I can only do a certain degree of treatment, what's going to give me the most return? And so there is always a cost. And for me, the opportunity cost, when I'm doing some type of something with the person just laying there on the table, and I'm looking up at the clock and I'm like, damn, like we got a lot of stuff to talk about. We got a lot of stuff to do. I got a whole plan that I need to get some buy-in and talk to them about. What are we doing right now? And so that's what it would hit me in the clinic, starting to whittle things away that were spending time on that aren't giving me the return. And so that's just something that you have to think about as a clinician, and everything, business, relationships, there's always an opportunity cost. When you make a decision and go with a decision, you have now whittled off the other decisions. So you can't do it all at once. And these are just things that you have to ask. And that's why informed consent is so important. Because we have to come to, like what Q said, we have to come to some type of shared decision making where the mutual purpose ultimately is their choice, but we are still the healthcare professionals, that we try to guide them towards the choice that, from a probabilistic standpoint, will provide the best long-term return.
Yeah, so maybe to piggyback off of that and kind of what I was saying then is, yes, they have a belief Someone's given them that belief at some point along the way. And so to simply just always give in to whatever their belief is, and they want ultrasound, so because they want it, even if I've given them the evidence they chose it, therefore I do it. I definitely would say that you should make every good intentioned effort to persuade them otherwise. And I think we hit on a few things, and it really isn't what we do anyways. Like the regression to the mean or the natural course of most things tend to get better without us, without our help. And I think as soon as you realize that they're with you, let's say you have an ideal situation, someone's coming into the clinic 3-4 times a week with you, and they're very good about following your plan and all the best things you do. I mean, they're still spending 23 hours out of that one that if you're not giving them that education of what will over the next year, 5 years, 10 years be helping them move towards increasingly better solutions to other problems that may arise in their life, you're probably going to be doing people a disservice by not educating them. But it is hard to find that balance there. But I did want to just clarify that that doesn't mean that you just always do whatever it is that they feel should be done because you are giving into the patient. There is a level of you are the clinician, you do know the evidence, and it's in your and their best interest to give them that knowledge and help them have those experiences and practices in the evidence-based direction.
Yeah.
Anybody have any thought? Yeah, go ahead, Alex. Sorry.
I was just going to say, I would definitely agree with that. I think that if the patient is coming to you, they kind of have this expectation that you are the authority or you're the expert on what's going to help them the best. And I think by saying that patient preference maybe weighs more than other things can be a real challenge, because if that would be the case, then what was the point of them coming to you in the first place if they could, per se get tens or could get to us to maybe have that difficult conversation with them. And I think a lot of times, to kind of address your the question you originally asked in the first place, like why or how we're going about doing that in the clinic, I think a lot of times it comes down to the fact that maybe clinicians have a hard time maybe having that conversation with patients, and it's a lot easier to just have somebody lay down on the table and you massage them or you put a needle in them or something like that, because it doesn't really involve a lot of conversation, but you just kind of doing something that, or they may not necessarily know about the evidence on that sort of thing, or may not have the time or care to kind of look at it. And I think it comes a lot down to like experience and just like what they've done, what they are used to, and what they feel comfortable with saying because they've done it for so long. Yeah, that's just kind of my thoughts on that.
So off of that, what are your guys' thoughts on the notion of kind of slow cooking the process of changing people's beliefs by giving them just a little bit of the thing that they want, and then kind of almost just whittling that off, weaning them off of the thing? So whether it be some type of manual therapy treatment, you have the conversations in the beginning, listen, this is probably not going to give us our long-term return. Do you still want it? Like, yeah, I do. And so what are your process is still what you believe is going to give them the best long-term return, but you're using that as kind of an entry point to at least get them to keep coming back to the clinic to finish out the plan of care, versus the alternative that maybe we're afraid of, where they just like don't come back at all because they're not getting any of the thing. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I kind of feel like, well, I mean, the best program doesn't matter if the person doesn't buy into it and adhere to it. So I feel like at some point you're at like this balance of what's the, the patient has a preference potentially that you don't agree with. Is there a way that you can balance it in a way where the patient feels bought into a majority, like kind of like you were saying, a majority of your program? And, if you didn't, and that client or that patient really feels strongly about, the type of treatment they want, are they just going to go to someone who that's all they're going to get? And that's, they can find, for the manual thing, okay, I'm just going to go to the next strip mall right across the street, and this guy's going to massage me for 30 minutes. And I don't have to do any of this exercise stuff, So I don't know. It's a little bit of a moral dilemma, I guess, but that's, it's interesting to talk about.
I think
You go ahead.
sorry, go ahead, Chris. Okay. Well, I think it's like a fine line, because there are people where, they can kind of get some learned helplessness. And I attached a blog by Eric Myra in the chat, where he talks about like you can condition someone, to like if they come in and they're like, I'm hurting, and you're like, oh, you're hurting? Well, I'll do manual therapy on you or whatever. And obviously, I'm assuming that's not just a conversation. You're going to have a bigger conversation. But if someone comes in like, I'm hurting, and you do manual therapy, and like, the treatment table is on the side of the gym, and then the exercise room is over there in the clinic, and it's like, oh, you're not in pain, you have to go get punished by doing exercise. Whereas if you're in pain, come over here where we're going to put you on the treatment table and do whatever you want. I think it's a fine line. I mean, I'm not entirely like, never do it, it's terrible, but I'm also not like, oh, if they say this, I'm going to do it. I think it depends on the person. If you kind of feel like they have a high degree of self-efficacy and a high determination to kind of like not see you every day, then maybe you could do it a little bit more. And then if someone's just kind of looks like they just want to be pampered, I hate to say like try to talk them out of it. There's a better way to say that, but you're kind of doing that, if that makes sense.
I think another piece of the puzzle too is because of our career, we know what to do when we're in pain. Like we know at what point we need to go see a doctor versus just modified programming versus like, man, I just need to take a rest day. But like a lot of our patients, they don't have the ability, they don't know how to do that. Like they don't know how to differentiate between okay pain versus not okay pain. And so I think for some of these people that come and see us, like pain for them is interfering with life. And so if they believe that manual is going to help them at least get back to life a little bit, then that's where I have to be a little bit more just kind of mellowed out and not so hot on like, no, I will not touch you. And we see a lot of post-ops. So I end up doing a good about but I think like y'all said, just like educating them along the way of kind of like, here's what we're doing, here's what we're not doing, here's why I'm doing this. And so I think I just always have to step back and like remember that like patients are not healthcare providers. Like they don't know what pain means. And if they feel like they just need a little bit of hands-on like attention for a second to feel like they're being seen and kind of steered back towards their activities, like I don't think it's the worst thing. Then just play devil's advocate. I don't know that there's actually research, and y'all can correct me, I'm not aware of any, of manual therapy leading to like dependency on a provider. I know that's like a common like narrative that we talk about, and one that would say that I'm very like, that I would agree to, but just playing devil's advocate, I don't know that there's even any evidence that would support what we think. I think we're making assumptions. And so I also have to keep that in mind, that I think it's about the narrative and the presentation of manual. So that's my thought.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think kind of like Nate said, it definitely depends on the patient that's in front of you. And I feel like during evaluations, I'm kind of gauging how much passive treatment, I guess, passive treatment we would call it, are they going to need in the beginning versus active. And I guess from session to session, kind of continuing to gauge that and see, like, can I start to tilt it a little bit more towards like more active treatments, and eventually kind of progressing them to the point of where not necessarily like relying on some of the manual stuff. But I feel like for a lot of patients to get that buy-in, it kind of almost is a little bit necessary in the beginning, at least until they get comfortable with you and until they you kind of like develop that relationship with them, but kind of always progressing them towards this end goal of allowing them to kind of manage things on their own, for sure.
Yeah, to add on to all of what y'all are saying. Also, I have really shitty Wi-Fi, so if I like go out, that's my bad. It like really an environmental thing. Like Quinn, you talk a lot about your clinic. You don't have many past modalities to even have the patient wonder about them or ask about them. Like you have the easy out of like, well, I don't have that, so let's do something else. And then like if you're in a mill clinic or traditional like outpatient ortho, you may have 3 or 4 clinicians doing exactly what you don't want to do, and that's such a bigger uphill battle you have to fight, because it's like an environmental thing. If you're home and you have a ton of snacks or you have a ton of dessert, like it's there in your face. But if you go to a clinic or see a PT and like all they have is barbells, turf, like all the other patients are training, that kind of sets the expectation. So I think it really depends on you as a clinician, where you're at, where, like, who are the other clinicians around you. So it probably really depends on that whole spectrum as well, because it's a lot easier to say, oh, I don't offer that because you literally don't have it, than to like have all of these modalities in your face that they could say, well, like it's right there. So that's also kind of another thought process.
And I have a question real quick for you, Quinn. Do patients like come to you already kind of having this expectation of how they're going to be treated? Like, do they already have preconceived notions of what treatment is going to be like, you know?
They do. And a lot of that is just filtered from the environment that I'm in, a clinic inside of a gym, the demographic that I talked, like Shelby mentioned that she gets a ton of post-ops. My office is cash-based and I don't get a lot of post-ops because it's expensive to not have to not do anything for the first like several weeks. And also like, I'm going to do quad sets with you like you would do if you did insurance. Like I can't do anything else. Some higher level stuff. So it's already kind of like I have this selection bias where they're coming in already pretty much knowing what this is going to be like. And I actually have in a lot of my intake information what to expect and what to expect not to get. And I explicitly state like what not to expect. I say this: prolonged blocks of manual therapy or passive modalities. Like I put that, and there's pros and cons to that. Like I'm trying to hedge my bets so that we don't have to have as much of this education communication during the session. That's kind of already accounted for. And then we can have education communication on other stuff, like push the needle forward as soon as possible. It's that opportunity cost. But at the same time, how many people am I turning away who read that and would have gone into my clinic with an opportunity for me to kind of change those beliefs, who just read that and say, he's too answer that question. So it works both ways. But to answer your question, yes, there's definitely a selection bias there. And it's funny, when we started this conversation, we're all like, well, where does patient preferences apply? Does it even apply? You know, we're the professional, but like, as soon as we started this conversation, literally all of us are like, well, it kind of depends on who we're talking about. And it kind of depends on what they're coming in with and our environment in the clinic. Yeah, it's easy for me to be like, well, I don't have an ultrasound machine versus you, who you have literally 4 ultrasound machines lined up against your wall and 2 of them are being used currently. So you can't say that, you know. And so like, well, why is your colleague using it when you just told me it doesn't do anything? We all have to take these things into account, right? So like, you don't want to throw your colleague under the bus or your just entire clinic. Like now your patient's like, well, do you guys even agree on shit? Like what's going on here? So this is where, that's why in Eric Mayer's model of the neck, because we can synthesize all the information and we can have, you know, have become closer to truth with the data. But what's the bottleneck here? It's the human in front of us, potentially, and the environment that we're in. And these are just all things to think about. And I think you guys bring up some amazing points like this. These are the limitations that we find ourselves in.
I have a question kind of off of that for, I guess, mostly for the people with a little bit more clinical experience. But when, maybe the patient, when they're not seeing you, or when they're seeing you, you have them bought into doing more evidence-based stuff and less of the, modalities and stuff like that. But how do you go about handling when a client comes to you and says, well, no, I can't see you next Wednesday. That's my weekly adjustment. Or, oh, I always go get massages on Fridays and stuff like that, where it's like, I guess, part of their weekly health routine or whatever you want to call it. How do you go about that interaction?
I'll throw this to the group first. It's a great question. Anybody have thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a conversation that comes up quite frequently. Mark, the same lady that I mentioned earlier that had frozen shoulder, just like her PCP wanted her to go see PT and go see her chiro. And so his thought was kind of like, I want like a whole team approach. Chiro can be kind of more like pain management, and then PT can be more, functional rehab. I think there's some clinicians that would say like, no, like I only want one variable at a time so that I know if what I'm doing is working. In that case, I'm fine if they go see other people, especially if her pain's getting better and she is able to do more with me. I'm not going to lose sleep over if she's seeing other people. And then I had a high school boy who's this week he was talking about like, yeah, like I need to go to the chiro because I need to, get adjusted. My sister can just like feel her spine being put back in place. And honestly just froze. I didn't like say anything. I said a lot of thoughts in my head and was like, I can't formulate like a thought that's going to be kind or like thoughtful right now. So I just was like quiet and was just like, yeah, like
cool.
Yeah. And so I think the biggest thing that I've learned is like, there's going to be patients that are ready to hear you like challenge that. And then there's going to be times that they are not ready to hear you challenge those things. And there's going to be times where you just have to sit back and like be thoughtful with how you reply, and you might not reply. That's a conversation that I anticipate coming back up because he's going to go, weekly or whatever. And his back has nothing to do with his shoulder. So I'm not super concerned about it. It's more like it bothers me that the narrative is like your alignment and your back has never gone out of place, but you think a human can put it back. Like it's not logical to me, but it's hard.
Yeah. Like I had this lady at my gym. It was the same thing. She's all like, I've been going to a chiro once a week for 2 years now, and we haven't gotten sick. So I was kind of like, oh, good for you. I don't know. They do well, and it's kind of like whatever. I just kind of take it on the chin. And if they asked me, I would say like, it's not possible that has really had anything to do with it. It's probably everything else you guys do in your life that is why you don't get sick. But yeah, I kind of just, especially like I'm not their provider. I'm just a gym goer, and they know I'm in PT school and they'll ask me for advice on some things. But like, even then I just try to keep my mouth shut. So.
Yeah, I think oh, sorry, go ahead.
Wait, no, all I was going to say is the situation I'm in is kind of unique too. I work at a VA in Monterey, and a very strong dry needling. I don't know what you want to call it, but a lot of the other clinicians and my CIs are very strong in the dry needling. They really want to do that. And so, I feel sometimes that I am up against barriers of people seeking that out because, I mean, from across the gym, you can see the chiropractor. There's two of them that work there, and there is those same language kind of things that come up, like Shelby was mentioning, of like, oh, I think my back's out of place, and I need to go, see the chiropractor to go put it in place. But I think I try not to fight it too much, and just I guess the biggest mistake, again, referencing the Crucial Conversations book, is like the fool's choice is that you're choosing between two bad things. One being that you stay silent and say nothing in the face of something you disagree, or you risk saying something and offending them or causing harm to their psyche or to offend another clinician. That's the fool's choice, where you think that those are your only two decisions, when in reality, there is another decision that allows you to educate and not offend. So you can speak up but not be offensive. And so I try to do that as best I can. I don't know how successful I am yet, but I'm trying to be, in that I educate them in the sense of, that's great. I hope that works for you, because you do, right? You want things to work for this person in their life, whatever it is. I hope that works for you. And I think you have to understand that a lot of those kind of things that are done to you from a clinician, whatever kind of type of clinician you see, will be temporary. You spent a lot of your life or a lot of time building up to whatever it is that you have going on right now. Style or behavior changes on your end to have a long-term change, and 5-10 years from now, I want you to still have things you can go back to that work for you over and over and over again. But if they say they want to go see a chiropractor to get their back put in place, okay, we'll schedule with the chiropractor. That's fine. Go get your adjustment or whatever it is. And if they come back and say, man, I'm feeling great, like, that's a huge win, right? Like, we know it probably didn't do that much, but like, if they're feeling great, they're probably moving more. They're probably doing activities more often in their life. They're willing to experience or, potentially like explore new movements because they just feel better. So if you can placebo them into, some things, I think other clinicians can placebo them into other things as well. And then you have the education piece now to come in and add the activities, the movements, the things that will have long-term changes. So I think, there is an practice to help people still move towards the end goal of moving towards the truth. If they think it's working, and all the passive stuff and all the stuff that we know doesn't really do too much, maybe, if they think it does, that's still a win, because now they're still going to be more willing to do all the more active stuff that you've done. So I try not to see it as much of a I win, then you win, and let's battle and fight heads on this, and more of a how can I still get my way while you're also still getting your way. And that seems to work well, at least right now. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, actually, I kind of wanted to jump in just real quick on this, because I'm kind of glad Quentin went first and mentioned some of that stuff, like that based on the person, how receptive they would be to new information varies a lot, and that's kind of like what Nate said. It's almost like a minor selection bias in someone's already questioning enough to ask, hey, what does this modality do? Whereas if they come in with a blanket statement, like they already have this formed belief around it, it's the narrative you bring in. Sure, you can educate, but also like you're going to qualify some of your statements so that it's not, like you mentioned, butting heads directly. And so I think all of this kind of ties into like the narrative we're providing the patient, based off of varying treatments, but like the timing of that and how difficult that is to get the tone and the message paired just right so that it has like a maximal effect in the patient's outcome. And so I kind of think that's where like clinical expertise comes in, and being able to read those situations and patient beliefs.
I had a couple thoughts, and you guys, this is great stuff. I mean, really, it's like, what do you want to get out of the conversation? And this is even a conversation, the same conversation if you're having it with a colleague and you guys are kind of arguing, discussing over certain ideas. So what do you really want to get out of this? And when you're having these discussions with the patient, is it our job to change all of their beliefs, even the ones that actually aren't going to have much of an effect in the long term with what we're talking about. So a lot of these examples, oh, you know, I've gone to my chiro once a week for the last 15 years of my life. Is changing that belief or changing that routine going to have an effect they're bringing to the table? Because there's an opportunity cost to you trying to get them to not believe that thing, that deeply rooted belief, emotional response. They're probably best friends with this other healthcare professional, probably comes over once a month for dinner. Like, does it actually matter, or are you letting your annoyance spill over into the conversation? Are you injecting your beliefs now? And is that going to move the needle forward with what you guys want to do? And these are rhetorical. Like, these are questions I ask myself, because my blood boils when I hear shit all the time. And I'm just like, Now I've gotten a lot better at pulling back and saying, like, hey, Quinn, like, you probably believe some stupid shit. Like, you probably have some beliefs and things too that you just do, and it's become a part of your life that doesn't have any merit behind it whatsoever. So, like, what's going to move the needle forward here? And I think I'm much more, I guess, tolerant is the word. Conversation out the door. I think they understand the situation. And then, like, as they're going out the door, well, what about XYZ? And it's like 3 different things that probably warrant their own conversation by themselves. And I've gotten a lot better at having the conversation of, you are ultimately, you're free to spend your money and time how you want. The reason that we're going to spend our time doing XYZ when you're with me is because of the reasons that we've already laid out. We've kind of already gone through those things. You are free to do those things. What I'm going to recommend is that you don't make those things the priority, or you don't think that those things are going to be what moves the needle forward versus what we've discussed. And what we've discussed is behavior change, training load management, specific exercise, all those things. And they tend to get that because they've been doing those other things, and they're in my office. So they're kind of already like, also don't want to flip their world upside down and take everything away just for the sake of it, especially because maybe it annoys me, and then therefore they should think the way I think, because what's the reality here? We're all wrong. So these are just, the questions are, is the belief that they have, albeit probably further from truth, is it actually affecting things? Is it actually going to affect their goals, or can they have that belief and we still are able to achieve the goals that we want from our perspective? And therefore, is that belief then worth it to change or try to change? Because belief change is hard anyway. We know that. So what beliefs are going to have the most bang for buck? What are you going to spend your time on? And I think that helps to kind of anchor the conversation a little bit, at least for me.
From the belief change aspect, that goes back to like motivational interviewing as well. And if like they come in the first session or the first time they see you and you just completely like invalidate all of what they've believed in the past, and you haven't had them like express, like they haven't verbalized actually asking you about what you think of stretching or foam rolling or chiro or whatever it is, like what would you expect for them? Like there's probably a huge backfire effect. And it's almost like you have to wait for that patient to actually, well, there has to be like some therapeutic alliance, but there also has to be like them asking you instead of you just like inadvertently telling them all of your like thoughts about it. But that's hard because you kind of have to build that, and that takes so much time. And then maybe it will never happen where there's so much like dissonance between what they think of you or what they think of their chiro, or there's kind of like a dissociation and they're like, well, I love my PT for doing this, but I also love my chiro, or like whatever the example is, that you have to have like these small changes over time. And like no one's perfect. And as you said, Quinn, like who knows what we think is great is probably not going to be great in 5-10 years.
You bring up a great point. Ask yourself this, like when in your life did you learn something new or come to a realization the first time that you heard it? Like, oh, I guess I was wrong about that thing that I've believed for 20 years. This is like, I'm seeing evidence to the contrary. Oh, I guess I believe that now. No, that's not how it works. And so it's this process of Chris, you said it. they have to come to the epiphany. Ultimately, for something to stick, it's them that figures it out. Now you arrange the environment and the situation so that they can come to that conclusion, and you kind of chip away at it. You ask them questions, you're a little Socratic about your method, and you're asking them, well, what do you think this does? And in that way, but it's them coming to the realization over the course of time that has its largest effect. And what you'll find, with long bouts of like stretching or foam rolling, things that are benign, but just it's an opportunity cost. And somebody will say, you know what, I just threw that out, or I cut that in half and I didn't feel any different, so that's good. Or I was feeling some pain when I was squatting, and so I just went a little bit lighter this time. Where that same person would usually just freak out about it and like they wouldn't just make that little modification. But those little things, like, they're so powerful because they're starting to get it, right? But what Chris said, like, it's a process. And if you just like vomit all of your like clinician beliefs and make it a 2-hour pain science education course in their first session, that's, like Chris mentioned, the backfire effect. A lot of times that can be what happens, because that's not how true learning occurs anyway.
Quinn, I wanted to hear your perspective, since a lot of us are still in school, of like having these conversations with clinicians and patients is hard, but having it with professors is almost like even harder. And I've had, and a few people on this call can like speak for this, but I've had a huge backfire effect, like my first year with trying to bring things up during class with professors, because it never goes well. And then like there's a palpable like tension with the whole class. So it's like, how do you bring up evidence-based practice where it's almost this like intellectual stalemate of, well, this is what I've found in the research. And then they say, well, this is the gold standard, or this is how it's best practice. It's like, that's just circular kind of reasoning on both of our parts. How do you even go about those discussions? And did you have like that butting of heads in your program, or did you just try to bite your tongue?
I definitely did have those. And I would love, like, the students in the group speak up on this, because you guys are living. So I came into PT school with a very large ego, and believe it or not, so it comes back to the question of, what are you trying to get out of this current situation? Like, speaking up in class, what are you truly going to get out of like coming at a professor in an argumentative way, or a very kind of dichotomous way? In that scenario, like, you don't have time to have a sit down. You got the whole class around you. Like, I would be surprised if there wasn't some like authoritative response on their end to try to kind of like push your head down. So you ask yourself that question, like, what is the environment in which, if discourse is your goal, like true, honest discourse, what's the environment that's going to foster that the best? And it's likely not your first semester in PT school, standing up and speaking out and like questioning something. Like, obviously you can do it in a delicate way, but what I found was that I got much better discourse and response and much more respect for my professors when I would go and meet with them privately. We would hash things out and we would talk about things, and I would ask them explicitly, would you be okay if I have certain questions in class and I raise them and I pose them? And that may seem like a kind of a passive approach, but my questions are, I want my classmates have probably the similar questions. So like, it's important to ask questions in class, because that's where learning occurs. So we're not saying don't do that, but there's a delicate way to pose them. And I found that my understanding was much better served, and my relationship with my professors got much stronger when I would actually have conversations with them privately. Or even if I didn't have that first, if my questions were much more of a question, as opposed to, I know this, but you said that, why? And that's a different feel. So I'll throw it to the group and see what you guys think about that, because I sucked at this back then. So I wasn't a great example of a role model.
So my first year in PT school, during our kinese class, we were talking about the knee, and there was a situation where there was maybe some nocebo messaging about certain squat depths and how it can affect the knee. And I said something, and I asked a question. It was actually during lab, and it was just like it was in front of a group of me and two other students to the teacher. And my teacher emailed me after class, and he brought me into his office and asked me to not ask any more, because it's confusing my classmates, and if he answered them, it would be over my knowledge currently, and it would just confuse me more and confuse other classmates. And my response was like, well, I'm kind of like, I'm in a doctoral level program. Like, isn't this a place to like have conversations like this? But a lot of my teachers at my school are, they're in their 25th year of teaching. They've been teaching this longer than I've been alive. And I'm at a point where like I'm not trying to convince my teachers so much as the 40 other kids that are sitting around me. So I've just been having a lot more like conversations with other classmates. And I mean, like Chris, this is awesome that you sent out to come to do stuff like this. And I think the approach of talking to a student versus trying to convince your teacher is maybe a little bit more of a realistic battle, if that makes sense.
I still wonder, because one great thing about my program was all of the professors were practicing clinicians currently, and that was like a big thing in my school. Like we don't have tenured professors who've been out of practice for 2 decades. It's like we practice, and so you could have these conversations about the content, but also about how it applies to practice. But I just wonder, Mark, even in those situations, if maybe if you kept kind of approaching that professor though in private, if they would open up and then be more welcoming, because it might just be one of those defense mechanisms thing where, hey, can you just not ask those questions because he doesn't know you, like it's right in the beginning. And it also is maybe don't give up on it.
Yeah, I didn't give up on it.
Okay.
And this year, other conversations that were more private, and yeah, that's kind of what harvest my opinion on maybe it's not worth that battle. And it kind of sucks because that teacher is the strength and conditioning specialist of our school. And it's been a little bit of a struggle for me during class, but yeah.
Well, and it comes down to the individual who we're talking about. So we talked about it with patients, but it's also like the professor, like the authority figure that we're talking about. Are they going to truly be open to anything? And if the answer is no, then even hearing things that you disagree with is useful because it helps you shape your thought process too, you know? Anybody else have thoughts on it? Like this approaching the discourse is how we move forward.
I think just maybe on like a advice piece, like if I was a student now, like knowing what I know now, one, I just admire a lot of the students that are here because y'all do a good job of this just already. But I think maybe instead of questioning the professor, maybe like a more like beneficial approach would be like maybe questioning why they think what they think rather than like, here's what I think and here's why I think what you're saying is wrong. Even though you're not saying that, could be how they're hearing that. And could be hearing that as you trying to discredit them in front of a whole class, which is not like ideal if you're a professor. But maybe just like, hey, like you mentioned this, can you just like expound a little bit more on like why you believe this because of X, Y, and Z, and seeing if they're a little bit more open to just going into a little bit more depth on why they believe what they believe rather than trying to impose what you believe onto them. But I super appreciate this. As a student, I didn't even know that I could question what I was learning. I just took it at face value. and then had my existential crisis afterwards. So
Yeah, I was definitely kind of the same. I guess maybe like during my last year in school is when I would say I guess I became like, woke or whatever. But I felt like I kind of took a similar approach to what Mark was saying, and rather than like question the professors, tried to get other students thinking about like different ways to think about things. And I feel like I had a challenging time with that because, like Shelby was saying, when you're a student, you're like just trying to get through school and you're trying to pass the test, and the test is what the professor says the test is. And so I felt like there's a little bit of a barrier there. And so I was kind of curious, like Chris, Kevin, and Nick, like what's been y'all's experience with, like, I mean, you guys are obviously like doing a pretty awesome job trying to keep yourself up to date or question things, but like what's been y'all's experience with doing the same thing with your classmates? I mean, like, are they almost like, why are you guys doing this? Why are you like asking the professors these questions? Just learn what you need to learn and, kind of stay in line sort of thing.
So I'd probably say I'm like one of the least liked people in my class. I could say pretty confidently just by some of the questions I bring up. But I think there's like an evolving kind of thought process of like this constant, like Nick, Kevin, and I have continual discussions on like, well, that didn't go well. Like, how can we work on that? And then we've spent a lot of time like carefully crafting emails to professors instead of bringing out things during class. And like, it's a continual battle of practicing it. And I think some students like kind of enjoy the dialogue or they're more interested. And then other students just maybe either think we're dicks or like we have such an ego, or they just could care less about like having prolonged conversation. So there's probably like a mishmash. But what I was going to say before you mentioned that, Alec, was like, and I told, I think, Alec and Shelby, and I won't get into specifics, but we had a professor who's pretty well known through the PT profession, and he sent the class like an article about manual therapy for potentially being like a help for the current COVID crisis. He sent like a little editorial, and it was a big leap. So Nick, Kevin, and I wrote, or at least I think maybe it was Kevin and I, it took us maybe like 2 or 3 hours to write a carefully crafted rebuttal email to the professor. And it's just like, it's such a weird world when you're in a doctorate level program and you feel like you have to step on like eggshells to like be as non-confrontive as possible to professor. Because I would assume in like master's programs, or especially PhD programs, there's a little bit less of this kind of like hierarchy and a little bit more of like continual like, okay, I believe this, you don't believe this. Like, it's just challenging each other's thoughts and not them as a person. And I think in PT school, it's still very much like you're challenging the professor and what they stand for and their beliefs, but it's really like you're just kind of questioning or being skeptical of what they're teaching. But it's really hard to come across that way. So Alec, like to your initial question, we're practicing, we're sending some emails, but I don't know, it's really hard to change like a professor's thoughts. And it's not like we're trying to change their thoughts. We're just trying to have like more nuanced conversation. And that's really hard to do in general.
Yeah, kind of trying to blend a couple of these. I like Quinn's suggestion of meeting with the professor individually and asking for permission to bring up certain types of questions. Just because I think that, predicted challenge in a class. But I think that's like a safe space almost for them. Because then they can allow that permission of how much challenge they want in their classroom. Because we kind of struggle with trying not to, sidetrack an entire lecture, because again, that's not really the place of a 2-hour lecture, and it takes 20 minutes to get through. Trying to sift through what the reasoning is. So I like that approach. It's also difficult to navigate that we're not directly challenging the individual, we're challenging their reasoning and the thought, really the reasoning. to these set standards that are supposed to be like the key takeaways from some of these lectures. And I think just like with any skill, we're fumbling through it, and as it's becoming less of a novel experience, we're hopefully getting a little better at it, but I'm not sure.
That's sorry, I had to step away for a second. So if you guys said this, just interrupt me and tell me to stop talking. But like, it's interesting what you all were saying about, like, I like the idea of going to a professor and talking to him or her and just bringing up the conversation. Cause like you said, it gives you that permission to speak. And so it's not like they're feeling attacked. Cause when it comes down to it, almost like, yes, like you are kind of attacking their authority, and then they're more so up against a wall. And we've talked about how like belief change does not happen on our own accord, but it happens on like them like walking through this like slowly. And I've talked about sometimes it's like we're almost not as worried about like this specific professor like belief changing, more so like other students in the class beginning to hear like the nuance added to these conversations. And I think that's where it's like, where else they're gonna hear it. Yes, we would love for all 43 of our classmates to come along and like be involved in journal club, but we've not had the opportunity of like really being exposed to good ways to read research or anything like that, which I think it seems like from other students, like they're doing the same thing at their schools, but like more so bringing up these conversations just so other students hear these things and maybe they start thinking, because it's like, where else are they going to hear it? Unfortunately, the professor's not providing any nuance in the conversation. So you're putting like, is it okay if I just put myself on the line and the relationship with my professor on the line at the benefit of other students? But also what we have like pissed off at Chris because they just think that he's like some jerk in class that just all he wants to do is talk about systematic reviews and they don't even know, and so it's like, it's a difficult thing,
One big thing in the Crucial Conversations book, as I'm thinking about this, is the environment has to feel safe. And Kevin, you mentioned that actually, that the classroom is a professor's like safe place because they're up on the literal pedestal, you're down sitting. So when you stand and profess your question to the world, whether or not, even if you do it in the most respectful way, that professor's safety has been violated, at least initially. That's just kind of the nature of being human. Emotion is injected into the situation. That's what we do. And that may only last like a split second, or it may be the way that they perceive the situation experience with that particular professor. Now that just could be a professor's way of, that's just the person that they are. But other professors might not be like that. They might have that emotional response in the beginning only be because of the abruptness of the situation. Whereas if you create more of a safe environment, as I mentioned, one way to do that is meet in person so that you can have a discourse where it's now safe for both of you. That sometimes can open up better dialogue even in the classroom, because now next time your hand goes up, they don't have that emotional response like, oh shit, Chris is going to ask another question. Like it's just, you've already kind of had this discussion, and they're not surprised by it. And it's not your job to make your professors feel safe, but I'm going to go back to what's your goal. And if your goal is to have the most nuanced, professional, beneficial discourse as possible, there are ways to make that happen and to make it safe, as the book would say. Start with heart, make it safe. But so that's just kind of, I'm just throwing that out there. And one thing that I wanted to end the conversation with, as we talk about these evidence-based practice, we talked about like the evidence as kind of the obvious one, right? Look at the total body of evidence, synthesize it to the best of your abilities. Patient values, we talked about that, but we kind of skipped over this middle part of the funnel, which is expertise. And we've gotten into it now with the professors, because what it sounds like a lot of them are kind of like falling back on their expertise and using that to like push your head down and say, no, I've got 25 years of experience. So you just hold your horses, young buck. But I wanted to talk to you guys about that. Like, where does expertise fall into this? Because I'll just throw out a little scenario. You know, if you're somebody who's torn your ACL and now you've gotten reconstruction and it's time for rehab, and you've got two choices.
Mhm.
You have a physical therapy student, a new grad, just graduated. All they've been doing for the past year and a half, like, is ACL. They just been everything ACL. That's what they love. Researched it, did a bunch of presentations on the ACL, but they've never actually rehabbed an ACL in the clinic. But they will tell you the most recent systematic reviews, and they'll like got the forest plot ingrained in their mind. They'll tell you all the studies and where the confidence intervals are. And then your other choice is somebody who's been a clinician for 25 years and who has, from start to finish, rehabbed 300 plus ACLs and couldn't tell you, you know, an apple from an orange when it came to the most recent systematic review on ACL research. So that's kind of the scenario. And I know that's anchoring to the extremes, but the question is, where does expertise fall into this kind of evidence-based practice concept? And I like to throw that out there as just kind of a general thought and see what you guys think about that.
I had this conversation with Alec. I don't know if you remember when we had that phone call and we were talking about like clinical expertise, of how that's such like a broad and ambiguous term, especially in like the PT world, and what Quentin was talking about with like regression to the mean and natural history. Like, you could have so many different practitioners have solid patient outcomes just because of those two things. And it's like, they could have not seen PT at all and they kind of probably gotten better. So like, how do you define clinical expertise? Is it based off the amount of time you've been a clinician, like 25 years, does that make you an expert? Is it based off of what you said, Quinn, like the amount of research you've done on the topic? And I think that's really hard to like have a working definition of clinical expertise, because I feel like it's a floating target. And I could say like all of my professors are experts because they're in their 50s or 60s. They have like, they've taken the boards, they are like licensed clinicians, they've seen it all. But like, what if they're not up, like, what if what they do like is complete contradiction to what other clinicians think? Like, how do you, I think that's just a really hard, like, I don't know. I just don't like the term of like an expert.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think clinical experience is important, no doubt. And I think if anyone says that, it's not, they're an idiot. But I mean, there also is bad experience, just like there's bad research or bad patient preferences. You know, there's also bad clinical expertise. You know, because like, what if the guy that's seen 300 ACL patients, like 3/4 of them are re-tears because this guy didn't meet any of the functional measures that we needed to do, or any of the strength measures that we needed to do for post-op ACL. So, you know, I mean, obviously you would know has done this many, you would probably be like, all right, well, what are the outcomes? And then that kind of goes into, like different kind of like who you would choose as a clinician, you know, because what if the guy that is all research based and whatever has seen someone, like, he's not worked with someone directly, but has seen a couple, you know, clinicians like Quinn, you know, take someone from start to finish from post-op, you know, I think then this guy could know a little something, you know. I don't know. I think, but I do think it's experience. It's important. You know, you want someone who's done it before, who was kind of walked the walk, and had good outcomes. So, yeah.
Kind of an idea I'm just having, like, as Nate's talking. So going back to like the funnel concept, you've got all this, like, this huge broad, you know, your clinician, your clinical expertise, and then patient preference. And I almost think that the clinical expertise is a large factor of that, is how efficacious your, like, communication and narrative is, disseminating the body of research and information down to the patient level. Is just kind of like one of the ideas I had. Because being well read is great, but if you're Rain Man, no one, you might not have the social cues, or I hate soft skills. You might not have like the empathy or like the effective communication to get that knowledge to be useful for the patient. That was just kind of an idea I had there.
Kind of really like that idea that you said about that, because I feel like in a different light, could clinical expertise be like super subjective to the patient? Like there's someone like that I'm thinking of at the moment who like he was telling me about a PT, and he's like, man, this guy is just like a wealth of knowledge. He knows so much. He's explained so much to me. And like hearing kind of the things that he's doing, I honestly, like, it blows my mind that he is able, like, just the things and like narratives he's providing to this guy. I'm like, I would never consider him an expert, and maybe like an expert in like giving BS to his patients, but not an expert in like the field of like like actual like physical therapy for like patients to promote autonomy. And it's like, it's kind of funny, but like I think like it kind of goes down if we're looking at buy-in from patients if you're not even perceived from them as like an expert, if that makes sense. And you could be perceived as an expert by one patient, and then one patient does not think that way because of like conflicting like viewpoints. But that's just something I kind of thought of, and I thought it was like interesting because I think expertise may be very subjective to the patient and their own experience with you.
And also, I just kind of wanted to put the disclaimer in there that I feel like as I was thinking through that, it almost is a little like patriarchal, like we know more, and this is what we present. Like they can't get to the research without us. And that's not really what I was trying to go with either. Like I could see that that's not what I was trying to say, is that like you, by all means, you don't need accessible for certain individuals. It's not like it has to flow through us. I don't know.
It could be more of an individual construct, this expertise, where this notion of just continuing to master your craft, always seeking to better yourself, that's honing your expertise. Because even, Chris, as you mentioned, well, we're trying to get better at having beneficial and constructive discourse with our professors. Well, how do you get better at it? You do it, and you put the reps in, and you learn from the priors that didn't go over well, so how can we do that better? But you wouldn't have had that without the experience of the failure and the outcome. So expertise and experience in that sense, if you're using it to update your processes and continuously going towards that truth, if you've got 25 years of that, but you're going to have 25 years of something. Regardless, 25 years is going to go by. And to know how that person spent that 25 years, I think, is the question that we're getting at. And that's a tough one to answer because we're really going off of what they say they spent their 25 years doing. Experience at the bare minimum for me as a student, you learn about a presentation of a patient on paper, and you kind of memorize what the words look like. And so now you can like, oh yeah, I know what ACL rehab looks like because I read it in section 3 on that book. But then you have that person in front of you and you're like, oh shit, that's what it looks like in real life. And sometimes you like see something for the first time in clinic, and it doesn't even dawn on you that you literally learned about this person like 2 weeks ago, because that person looks way different on a page than it does in real life. And so like that now contextual experience is very powerful. When you're a new grad or a student, literally a butterfly. But as you see more, as you get reps under your belt and you update your priors, you start to now be more in tune with patterns, which can be useful too. So we kind of get into this like expertise and experience is this nebulous thing, but when we anchor it to how learning occurs, which is by repeated exposure, we can say that it matters. And then we can kind of get into this nuance of, what are we actually talking about? Because I agree, it's nebulous. But we've, in so many words, already explained how, exposure and learning and, it makes a difference. But those are just kind of my thoughts based on the conversation here. You guys have any follow up on that?
Yeah, I was just kind of thinking of where we started this whole conversation and the potential cynical side of the evidence-based practice, or maybe just scenario of the student who has spent so much time with ACLs over the last year and a half and knows everything. I think it's intuitive that we can all see the almost not uselessness of that, but a lot of the missing links in that. And that is, in that scenario, the epitome of what it is to be extremely reliant on the evidence. But if there is nothing else in conjunction with that reliance on the evidence, then that evidence becomes much less useful. And I think that is maybe some of what the authors initially had been hinting at in some ways, is that yes, evidence in and of itself and the truth that we think we know may be far from the actual truth still, but we are moving that direction. Evidence does not help the same way that all three of those pillars or all three of those Venn diagram circles that when they meet are. And I think that's kind of what we've been hinting at, is that yes, there is a very real uselessness of some of these very important key factors when they are not performed together. So I like the way that we're kind of spinning all this together and have come full circle in a way in my mind. I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts about that, but that's kind of what's going on in my head right now.
It's like the dynamical systems model of evidence-based medicine. You can't have one, they're embedded in each other. Right? It's like pain. The brain in a vat doesn't work out that way. The organism with how it interacts with the environment. And so for us, our understanding of and dissemination of the evidence and how it actually integrates into the environment based on our differences, and like you can't separate these things truly. But being better able to manage those things, is kind of what we're getting at. And then updating, that's just that alone. I think the evidence points to this too. We're much less apt to update our prior beliefs the older we get. Literally, sometimes it's just age. Like, you're much less likely to listen to a new style of music after the age of 30. You're pretty much dialed into the shit that you listened to like when you were a teenager. And it goes in fashion too. So all these things. So why would this be much different, except that we should be held to a higher standard because we have this education? But updating your priors is really what this is about. And that becomes harder and harder the more you think you know. And so like even just this is so, so important, because how many clinicians Saturday afternoon in a meeting like this? Very few. I know a couple, but it's this young, hungry cohort. Don't lose this, because this is 25 years of this. Like, dang, that's crazy. Like, that would move this profession forward. I just think we lose that somehow. And so like, expertise is expertise on the surface level. And that's where we're like, well, that doesn't mean anything. But if you whittle it down and you say, well, I know, Nate does this and he updates his beliefs because I have this Discord, with him, and I've known him for 10 years now. We've been having these discussions. Like, now I'm comfortable calling Nate an expert,
Quinn,
that's just kind of where I sit with it.
Expert?
Huh?
Would you call yourself an expert?
No, fuck. No. No. I don't know if that's a title that's self-selected or not. That's an interesting conversation by itself, huh?
I say no. That's a pet peeve of mine.
Yeah.
Self-proclaimed ACL experts.
I can give I can tell them that I have, I have an interest and a passion in this, and I currently work with this population. And if they ask me follow-up questions, then I'll answer those. But yeah, that's an interesting construct there. Do I want other people to think of me as an expert? Do I want my patients to think of me as an expert? Probably.
It's like the shore of ignorance, the island of knowledge and the shore of ignorance. When you get smarter, you realize my shore of ignorance increases. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. I feel like every time I learn, you kind of just realize that you've been wrong so much that you're like, all right, like, I'm wrong again. What to do? Like, I don't know. Those are kind of my thoughts when I keep learning things and I keep reading. I'm like, oh man, that flipped my world upside down. Well, what's new?
Well, whether you know it or not, though, you never go all the way back. Like, you make progress every time that you come to those realizations. You come back to a higher level. It's just such a slow process. You don't actually feel it in real time. But you look back to yourself, compared to yourself 3, 5, 10 years ago, like, as you go through this process, there will be a lot of growth. If you're doing the same shit that you were doing a decade ago, that's maybe a heuristic. If somebody's an expert or they're not an expert, if they're doing the same stuff that they were doing 20 years ago. Or if they haven't come full circle, because that's maybe a different conversation.
Hey, what if they were just 20 years ahead of their time?
Could be. I mean, it takes about 20 years for the evidence to update itself or practice to update itself.
Right. You're talking about like that 17 years, like the answer 17 years paper. Yeah.
What else you guys got? It's a good one.
Yeah, we can wrap it up there, Quinn, because it's been like an hour and 40. But yeah, I just want to say thanks for joining the party, and even just for like clinical athlete in general and all you've done. I mean, I've been following you since like freshman. I think I was like 18. So the amount that like you've progressed through just like clinical athlete and all the things you do is like, I think, a huge help for just students bringing like our autonomy to having these conversations and like creating, like, I probably wouldn't have created a journal club if you didn't have a clinical athlete journal club or all the things that go on in the forum. So props to you for kind of like pushing this self-efficacy with students and with like new grads.
I appreciate that, man. Obviously glad it's helpful, but I mean, this is what keeps it going. Like, I see you guys and I see it's all, the tide raises all the boats, So this is fantastic what you guys are doing.
Yeah.
Glad to be part of it.
Yeah, man. All right. Thank you for everyone who's come. I recorded, so if anyone doesn't want me to record it, too late. But yeah, enjoy the rest of y'all's Saturdays. I appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Adios.